In the late 1960s, as the Cold War entered a phase defined less by overt superpower confrontation and more by internal destabilization within Western societies, Italy became the stage for a prolonged and violent crisis that blurred the boundary between democracy and covert war, because the period later known as the Years of Lead unfolded not as a single insurgency or coup attempt, but as a sustained condition of political violence, psychological pressure, and hidden manipulation that eroded trust in institutions while preserving the outward form of constitutional rule. And this mattered because Italy was not a fragile post-colonial state or a military dictatorship, but a founding member of the Western Alliance, whose internal collapse would have carried immense strategic consequences for NATO and the balance of power in Europe. And the roots of this crisis lay in Italy's unresolved post-war settlement, where the end of fascism had produced a democratic republic without fully dismantling the structures, networks, and fears inherited from World War II, leaving behind a society polarized between a powerful communist party, mass labor movements, conservative elites, and security institutions deeply shaped by anti-communist imperatives. And this polarization intensified during the economic and social upheavals of the 1960s, as student movements, factory strikes, and cultural rebellion challenged authority across Europe. But in Italy, these pressures were amplified by the presence of the largest communist movement in the Western world, raising persistent fears among conservative forces that electoral democracy might eventually deliver power to the left, a prospect viewed in Washington and within Italian intelligence circles as unacceptable in the context of the Cold War. And it was within this atmosphere of fear and radicalization that political violence began to escalate, not as an immediate collapse, but as a gradual normalization of terror, where bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings became tools not only of revolutionary groups, but of destabilization strategies designed to shape public perception and political outcomes. And the first major shock came in December 1969, with the bombing at Piazza Fontana in Milan, an attack that killed civilians and shattered the illusion that post-war Italy was insulated from internal war, and the initial attribution of the attack to anarchists, followed by the mysterious death of suspect Giuseppe Pinelli in police custody, set the tone for the decade to come, because it revealed how truth itself would become contested terrain, shaped by disinformation, coerced confessions, and selective investigations. And this pattern mattered because it undermined confidence in the state, while simultaneously justifying expanded security powers, creating a feedback loop in which fear demanded control, and control generated further suspicion. And as violence spread, the Italian state faced threats from both extremes. As far-right, terrorist groups sought to provoke authoritarian backlash through mass casualty attacks, while far-left organizations such as the Red Brigades embraced armed struggle as a means of destabilizing what they viewed as a corrupt, imperial system aligned with American power. And yet the defining feature of the Years of Lead was not merely the existence of terrorism, but the persistent allegation and mounting evidence that elements within the state itself manipulated, tolerated, or exploited violence to steer Italy away from political outcomes deemed dangerous, a phenomenon often described as the strategy of tension, in which terror was used not to overthrow the system directly, but to frighten the population into accepting stronger security measures and excluding the left from power. And this strategy thrived in a context where intelligence services operated with limited oversight. Cold War secrecy justified extraordinary actions, and alliances with NATO created parallel structures of power whose accountability remained opaque. And throughout the 1970s, Italy existed in a condition of suspended crisis, where elections continued, parliaments met, and governments formed and collapsed with remarkable frequency. Yet beneath this surface normality ran a current of continuous violence that reshaped everyday life. As police checkpoints, armed escorts, and emergency laws became routine, and the constant threat of attack altered public psychology, producing a society accustomed to fear without clarity about its source. And this ambiguity was the essence of the years of lead, because the question was never simply who was pulling the trigger, but who benefited from the climate of terror. And as investigations repeatedly stalled or were diverted, suspicions deepened that the line between defender and manipulator of democracy had become dangerously thin. And in this sense, Italy's crisis was not an anomaly, but a revealing expression of the Cold War's internal front, where the struggle against communism was waged not only through elections and alliances, but through covert operations, deniable violence, and psychological conditioning of the population. And as the years progressed, this internal war would reach its most dramatic and devastating moments, exposing how far a democratic state could be pushed toward secrecy, repression, and moral compromise without formally abandoning its constitutional identity. As the 1970s unfolded, the Italian years of lead intensified into a complex web of violence and counter-violence that made it increasingly difficult to distinguish between insurgency, repression, and manipulation, because the escalation was driven not by a single revolutionary momentum, but by overlapping dynamics that fed on each other, drawing extremist groups, security services, political parties, and foreign interests into a murky struggle over Italy's future. And this mattered because the country's democratic institutions continued to function even as their credibility eroded, creating a paradox in which constitutional order survived, alongside a pervasive sense that unseen forces were shaping events beyond public control. And within this environment, far-right terrorist organizations carried out a series of bombings designed to maximize civilian casualties and public fear. Attacks whose apparent randomness masked a strategic logic aimed at discrediting the left and fostering a climate in which authoritarian solutions could appear necessary. And these attacks were often followed by investigations that misdirected blame toward anarchists or left-wing activists, reinforcing the perception that justice itself had been weaponized, while behind-the-scenes connections between extremist networks and segments of the security apparatus slowly came to light, suggesting that the boundary between state and subversion had become dangerously porous. And at the same time, far-left groups radicalized in response to both repression and perceived collusion, arguing that democratic channels had been rendered meaningless by covert manipulation. And among these groups, the Red Brigades emerged as the most disciplined and lethal, pursuing a strategy of targeted kidnappings and assassinations aimed at striking the heart of the state and exposing what they described as the true nature of bourgeois democracy under Cold War conditions. And this escalation transformed political life, as judges, journalists, industrialists, and politicians became targets, forcing the normalization of armed protection and creating an atmosphere in which everyday routines were shaped by the expectation of sudden violence, and the state responded with increasingly expansive emergency measures, strengthening police powers, expanding surveillance, and prosecuting terrorism with a severity that blurred the line between defense and repression. And these measures, while effective in weakening armed groups over time, also deepened mistrust because they were implemented in a context where past abuses had already undermined confidence in the neutrality of institutions. And this erosion of trust was compounded by revelations about clandestine structures within Italy's security architecture, including secret networks and contingency plans linked to NATO that were justified as safeguards against communist takeover, but perceived by many as parallel states operating beyond democratic oversight. And this perception reinforced the belief that Italy was fighting not only terrorists, but a hidden war within its own system, where outcomes were managed through fear rather than consent. And the cumulative effect was a society caught in a feedback loop of violence and suspicion, where each attack hardened positions, narrowed political space, and justified further secrecy. And as the decade progressed, the years of lead became less about isolated acts of terror and more about the corrosion of democratic legitimacy itself, revealing how the Cold War's internal pressures could transform a democratic state into a landscape of permanent emergency without a formal rupture. And it was within this deteriorating equilibrium that Italy would experience its most symbolic and devastating moment, an event that crystallized the contradictions of the era and forced the nation to confront the true cost of governing through fear and denial. As Italy moved deeper into the 1970s, the years of lead reached a moment of acute crisis that revealed the full extent to which political violence had penetrated the state. Because the kidnapping and assassination of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978 exposed not only the brutality of left-wing terrorism, but the paralysis and moral exhaustion of a system trapped between fear of collapse and fear of change. And this moment mattered because Moro had embodied a potential political breakthrough, advocating for a historic compromise that would bring the Communist Party into a governing arrangement and stabilize Italy through inclusion rather than exclusion, a strategy that threatened entrenched interests both domestically and within the broader Cold War order, where the prospect of communists participating in government in a key NATO country was viewed with deep suspicion. And when the Red Brigades abducted Moro, they framed the act as a revolutionary trial of the state, demanding the release of imprisoned militants and seeking to demonstrate that the government's authority could be challenged directly. Yet the state's response revealed a deeper rigidity, because rather than negotiating, it adopted a position of absolute refusal, insisting that any compromise would legitimize terrorism and unravel democratic order. And this refusal was shaped not only by principle, but by the fear that yielding would expose the fragility of the state and accelerate forces it could no longer control. And as weeks passed with Moro held captive and appeals for negotiation divided public opinion, Italy existed in a state of suspended anguish, where daily life continued under the weight of an unresolved crisis that symbolized the country's broader paralysis. And when Moro was ultimately murdered, his body left in a car positioned symbolically between the headquarters of rival political parties, the act resonated as a verdict on the entire system, signaling that the attempt to reconcile democracy with exclusion and secrecy had failed catastrophically, and the aftermath intensified repression as the state expanded its counterterrorism apparatus and moved decisively to dismantle armed groups, achieving significant successes in arrests and convictions that would eventually end the cycle of violence. Yet these successes did not erase the questions raised by Moro's death, because the refusal to negotiate and the circumstances surrounding the investigation reinforced suspicions that political considerations had overridden human life, deepening cynicism toward institutions already weakened by years of disinformation and covert maneuvering. And at the same time, revelations continued to emerge about the manipulation of earlier attacks, including evidence that far-right terrorism had been shielded or misdirected through compromised investigations, confirming long-held fears that parts of the state had tolerated or exploited violence to shape political outcomes. And this confirmation mattered because it demonstrated that the years of lead were not simply a breakdown of order, but a managed crisis, one in which fear functioned as a tool of governance, disciplining society while preserving formal democratic structures, and as armed groups were dismantled and bombings became less frequent. Italy entered the late 1970s and early 1980s with a fragile calm, yet this calm rested on unresolved trauma, because the violence had ended without a clear accounting of responsibility, leaving behind a legacy of mistrust that would continue to shape Italian political culture. And in this sense, the years of lead did not conclude with victory or reconciliation, but with exhaustion, a condition in which society accepted stability without clarity, security without truth, and democracy without full transparency. And this outcome reveals how Cold War pressures could distort democratic life from within, producing a form of internal warfare that avoided overt dictatorship while corroding legitimacy. And it is this corrosion, rather than any single act of terror, that defines the true cost of the Italian years of lead, marking them as one of the Cold War's most unsettling internal conflicts, where the line between defender and manipulator of democracy was not merely blurred, but deliberately obscured. As the immediate wave of violence receded toward the end of the 1970s, Italy entered a period of uneasy stabilization that masked how deeply the years of lead had altered the country's political and psychological landscape, because although terrorist organizations were dismantled and bombings declined, the methods used to restore order left behind a legacy of expanded security powers, unresolved investigations, and institutional opacity that continued to shape governance long after the gunfire stopped. And this mattered because the end of visible violence was widely interpreted as a return to normality, even as the underlying questions about responsibility, manipulation, and accountability remained unanswered, creating a democracy that functioned procedurally while carrying unhealed wounds. And the state's victory over armed groups was achieved through a combination of aggressive policing, intelligence penetration, and legal innovations that weakened insurgent networks decisively. Yet these successes were accompanied by amnesties, sealed archives, and fragmented judicial outcomes that prevented a full reconstruction of how violence had been enabled, tolerated, or exploited. And this partial resolution reinforced public suspicion that the truth had been sacrificed for stability, a trade-off that many accepted reluctantly in exchange for an end to fear. And within Italian society, this acceptance produced a complex emotional aftermath, as relief coexisted with cynicism, and political engagement gave way to disengagement among citizens who no longer believed that institutions operated transparently. And this disengagement mattered because it marked a shift in the relationship between state and society, reducing participation and trust while preserving formal democratic structures. And the Cold War context played a decisive role in shaping this outcome, because Italy's strategic importance within NATO encouraged both domestic and foreign actors to prioritize containment over disclosure, ensuring that revelations which might destabilize alliances or reopen political fractures were managed carefully or deferred indefinitely. And this management reinforced the sense that sovereignty itself had been compromised by external pressures, deepening the perception that Italian democracy had been constrained by forces beyond electoral choice. And as the years of lead faded into memory, cultural and intellectual life became one of the primary arenas in which the period was processed, as films, literature, and investigative journalism sought to recover fragments of truth that official narratives had left unresolved. And this cultural reckoning revealed how deeply the experience of sustained fear and ambiguity had penetrated daily life, shaping a generation's understanding of politics as something opaque and dangerous rather than participatory. And this generational impact underscores the broader significance of the years of lead, because it shows how internal Cold War conflict could reshape democratic culture without producing visible regime change, altering expectations, behavior, and trust through prolonged exposure to uncertainty, And internationally, Italy's experience offered a cautionary example of how democracies could be destabilized from within through a combination of extremism and covert manipulation, demonstrating that the Cold War's internal front was as consequential as its proxy wars. And as historians revisited the period, the concept of the strategy of tension became central to understanding how violence functioned not only as an expression of radical ideology, but as a mechanism for controlling political trajectories, keeping society polarized and fearful enough to prevent transformative change. And this interpretation, while contested, captured the essence of the era's ambiguity, because it acknowledged both the agency of terrorist groups and the structural conditions that allowed violence to persist without resolution. And in this sense, the years of lead represent a form of conflict uniquely suited to the Cold War, one that avoided overt dictatorship while hollowing out democratic confidence, leaving behind a society that was outwardly stable, yet inwardly marked by doubt. And as Italy moved forward into the 1980s, the absence of a definitive reckoning ensured that the period would remain unresolved, not as an active war, but as a lingering question about how close a democracy can come to covert conflict with itself before its legitimacy is irreversibly damaged. As historical distance increased, the Italian years of lead came to be understood less as a temporary breakdown and more as a structural crisis produced by the Cold War's internal pressures, because the violence was not an accident of radical excess, but the outcome of a system designed to manage political risk through exclusion, secrecy, and fear. And this mattered because it revealed how democracies could be deformed without being overthrown, maintaining elections and constitutions while hollowing out public trust and accountability. And in Italy, this deformation was visible in the persistence of unanswered questions surrounding major attacks, compromised investigations, and the reluctance of the state to fully expose the role of intelligence services and clandestine networks. A reluctance that suggested stability had been purchased at the price of truth. And this trade-off shaped the country's post-Cold War transition, because when the bipolar order collapsed, the unresolved legacies of the years of lead resurfaced, alongside broader crises of corruption and institutional legitimacy, reinforcing the sense that Italy's democracy had long operated under hidden constraints. And this sense mattered because it undermined confidence in political renewal, making cynicism a rational response rather than a failure of civic responsibility. And within this environment, the memory of political violence functioned as both warning and excuse, invoked to justify caution and incrementalism while discouraging transformative change. And this dynamic illustrates how fear, once normalized, can outlive the conditions that produced it, continuing to shape behavior long after the threat has receded. And internationally, the Italian case challenged assumptions about the resilience of Western democracies during the Cold War, showing that internal conflict could be managed without overt repression, yet still inflict lasting damage on legitimacy. And this insight has informed subsequent analyses of democratic erosion, highlighting the role of secrecy, emergency powers, and manipulated fear in sustaining order without consent. And as scholars debated the extent to which the strategy of tension represented coordinated conspiracy or systemic failure, the enduring reality was that violence had been allowed to persist in ways that served political ends, regardless of whether those ends were consciously orchestrated or structurally produced. And this ambiguity is itself central to the years of lead, because it reflects a condition in which responsibility was diffused across institutions, making accountability elusive and closure impossible. And for Italian society, this lack of closure ensured that the period remained unsettled, not as an open wound, but as a scar that shaped political instincts and expectations, reinforcing skepticism toward authority and reluctance to trust official narratives. And in this sense, the years of lead illustrate a core Cold War paradox, that efforts to preserve democracy through covert means can erode the very legitimacy they aim to protect, producing stability that rests on silence rather than consent. And as Italy moved further from the era of bombs and kidnappings, the unresolved nature of the conflict became its most enduring feature, reminding observers that the Cold War's internal wars did not always end with clear victories or defeats, but with negotiated forgetting, where peace was achieved not by reckoning, but by exhaustion, leaving behind questions that continue to challenge democratic self-understanding. As Italy entered the 1980s and the Cold War itself began to shift toward a period of gradual decline, the years of lead increasingly appeared as a warning about how democratic systems can survive formal crisis while absorbing damage that alters their character in lasting ways, because the violence had not destroyed the republic, but had changed the relationship between citizens and the state, replacing expectations of transparency and participation with habits of caution, skepticism, and disengagement. And this mattered because it revealed that democracy can persist institutionally while eroding socially, a condition made possible by prolonged exposure to fear and secrecy that normalized exceptional measures without demanding permanent accountability. And in Italy, this normalization was evident in the acceptance of unresolved investigations and partial truths as the price of stability, an acceptance shaped by the collective exhaustion of a society eager to move beyond terror, even if doing so meant abandoning the hope of full clarity. And this abandonment carried consequences because it entrenched a political culture in which suspicion toward institutions became rational rather than pathological, and where public discourse often assumed that official explanations concealed deeper realities, and this assumption shaped media, art, and political debate, reinforcing a climate in which trust was difficult to rebuild. And from a Cold War perspective, this outcome highlights how internal conflict could achieve what external enemies could not, weakening democratic legitimacy from within without triggering overt authoritarianism. And this form of erosion was particularly dangerous because it was incremental and deniable, unfolding through emergency laws, intelligence opacity, and selective justice rather than coups or dictatorships. And internationally, Italy's experience resonated as a case study in the management of internal threat, influencing debates about counterterrorism and state secrecy that extended beyond the Cold War into the post-Cold War era, where similar tensions between security and accountability re-emerged under new guises. And this continuity underscores the years of lead's enduring relevance, because it demonstrates that the mechanisms used to contain perceived threats can become permanent features of governance, shaping political life long after the original danger has passed. And for Italian society, the legacy of this period remains embedded in memory, not as a single narrative, but as a contested field of interpretation where competing explanations coexist without resolution, reflecting the fact that the truth of the years of lead was fragmented by design. And this fragmentation itself became part of the outcome, ensuring that no definitive account could fully restore confidence. And in this sense, the period represents a Cold War conflict whose most significant effects were psychological and institutional, rather than territorial or ideological, revealing how democracy can be strained to the point of transformation without formal rupture. And as historians continue to analyze the era, the years of lead stand as a reminder that the Cold War's internal front was often fought through ambiguity and fear, rather than open confrontation, producing societies that emerged intact yet altered, carrying forward the imprint of a war that had never been officially declared, but had shaped daily life for more than a decade, and whose consequences continue to inform debates about power, secrecy, and legitimacy in democratic states. As scholars and investigators revisited the Italian years of lead with access to newly declassified material and testimony, the period increasingly emerged as a case where the absence of definitive truth was not accidental but structural, because the conditions of the Cold War rewarded ambiguity, deniability, and compartmentalization, allowing violence to persist without clear attribution while preserving plausible narratives of democratic stability. And this mattered because it meant that responsibility for the era's terror could rarely be assigned cleanly, dissolving accountability across extremist groups, intelligence services, political actors, and foreign interests whose interactions were often indirect yet mutually reinforcing. And in Italy, this diffusion of responsibility ensured that no single reckoning could fully resolve the past, as each revelation raised further questions without providing closure, and this perpetual incompleteness shaped how the period was remembered, transforming it into a symbol of mistrust rather than a settled historical chapter. And within this environment, the strategy of tension became less a single conspiracy than a description of systemic behavior, in which fear functioned as a stabilizing force by narrowing political options and disciplining public expectation. And this interpretation does not absolve terrorist organizations of agency or intent, but situates their actions within a broader framework that allowed violence to achieve political effect beyond the goals of its immediate perpetrators. And this framework was sustained by Cold War imperatives that treated Italy not primarily as a sovereign polity, but as a strategic space whose orientation had to be secured, even at the cost of internal distortion. And this external pressure reinforced domestic reluctance to fully expose covert operations, because doing so risked destabilizing alliances and reopening questions that had been suppressed in the name of security. And as a result, Italy entered the post-Cold War era with unresolved legacies that shaped its democratic evolution, contributing to cycles of political crisis and reform that reflected deeper uncertainty about institutional integrity. And this uncertainty underscores the broader significance of the years of lead, because it shows how internal Cold War conflict can outlast the geopolitical conditions that produced it, embedding skepticism and fragmentation into political culture long after bombs stop exploding. And in this sense, the Italian experience offers a cautionary lesson about the cost of governing through fear and secrecy, revealing that while such methods can prevent immediate transformation, they extract a long-term price in legitimacy and trust. And as Italy moved forward, the unresolved nature of the years of lead remained a silent reference point, influencing how citizens interpreted power and how institutions justified authority, ensuring that the period's true legacy was not merely a decade of violence, but a lasting alteration in the relationship between democracy and the truth it claims to represent. As the Italian years of lead receded further into history, the period came to be recognized as a defining moment in which democracy survived not through clarity or reconciliation, but through endurance, absorbing violence and manipulation without collapsing, while simultaneously accepting compromises that reshaped its moral boundaries. And this recognition matters, because it reveals how political systems can emerge intact, yet fundamentally altered, carrying forward habits of secrecy and mistrust that become normalized over time. And in Italy, this normalization was evident in the way unresolved cases, sealed archives, and partial disclosures became part of the political landscape, reinforcing a culture in which citizens learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent condition rather than a temporary failure. And this adaptation shaped political behavior, reducing expectations of transparency and encouraging disengagement as a rational response to a system perceived as opaque. And from a Cold War perspective, this outcome underscores how internal conflict could achieve strategic objectives without overt repression, because fear and ambiguity proved sufficient to constrain political possibilities while preserving the appearance of democratic choice. And this form of control was particularly effective because it avoided the backlash that accompanies open authoritarianism, allowing institutions to claim continuity even as their credibility eroded. And internationally, Italy's experience contributed to a broader understanding of how democracies can be destabilized from within through a combination of extremism, covert operations, and managed insecurity, a pattern that would reappear in later contexts under different guises. And as historians continued to debate the extent of coordination versus systemic failure, the enduring reality remained that the years of lead functioned as a prolonged stress test for democratic legitimacy, exposing how easily emergency logic can become permanent when accountability is deferred. And this deferral left Italy with a past that resisted closure, because every attempt to narrate the period encountered gaps and contradictions that reflected the very conditions under which violence had been sustained. And this resistance to closure is itself a legacy of the era, demonstrating how the Cold War's internal front produced conflicts that could not be neatly resolved once the geopolitical threat receded. And in this sense, the years of lead stand as a reminder that democracy can be weakened not only by coups or revolutions, but by prolonged exposure to fear, secrecy, and denial, forces that reshape political culture quietly yet decisively. And as Italy continued to confront new challenges in the post-Cold War world, the memory of this period lingered as an unspoken reference point, shaping skepticism toward authority and reinforcing the lesson that stability achieved without truth carries a cost that endures long after the violence has ended. In closing, the Italian years of lead stand as one of the Cold War's most disturbing internal conflicts, because they demonstrate how a democratic state can be drawn into a prolonged condition of covert warfare against itself, where violence, fear, and secrecy become tools of political management rather than signs of collapse. And what makes this period so consequential is not only the number of lives lost to bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings, but the way in which truth itself was fractured, investigations diverted, and responsibility diffused until accountability became almost impossible, allowing stability to be restored without reconciliation. And this outcome mattered because it revealed a central Cold War paradox, that the defense of democracy against perceived existential threats could justify practices that hollowed out democratic legitimacy from within, producing a system that endured institutionally while losing moral clarity. And in Italy, this endurance came at the cost of public trust, as generations learned to interpret politics through suspicion, assuming that official narratives conceal deeper realities shaped by intelligence manipulation and strategic necessity. And this assumption reshaped political culture, narrowing expectations of transparency and participation while normalizing the idea that some truths were permanently inaccessible. And from a broader Cold War perspective, the years of lead expose how ideological confrontation was not confined to borders or proxy wars, but unfolded inside societies deemed secure, where the fear of communism, the pressure of alliance politics, and the willingness to tolerate covert action combined to create environments in which violence could be instrumentalized without overt dictatorship. And this instrumentalization left scars that outlasted the era itself, because even after terrorism was defeated and the Cold War ended, the unresolved legacy of the years of lead continued to shape debates about state power, secrecy, and legitimacy. reminding observers that democracy can survive extraordinary strain, yet emerge transformed by it. And in this sense, the Italian experience serves as a warning rather than an anomaly, illustrating how easily the line between protection and manipulation can blur under conditions of sustained fear, and how societies may accept ambiguity as the price of stability, only to discover later that the cost was a lasting erosion of confidence in the institutions meant to represent them. And as history continues to reassess the Cold War's internal front, the years of lead remain a defining example of how covert war can exist within democracy without formally destroying it, leaving behind not ruins but doubts, and ensuring that the most enduring damage of the era was not inflicted by bombs alone, but by the gradual normalization of secrecy, fear, and unresolved truth at the heart of public life.